Howdy folks, I am Neil, and today I'm going to be doing a DIY project, installing a 2.5-inch TeraFlex coil spring lift with shocks on my two-door JK Wrangler. I got the lift kit from offroadsource.com. I've never done this before, but I do have a floor jack and a lot of determination, so let's give it a go. Okay, obviously you're going to want to start out by raising the Jeep up and placing jack stands securely under the frame, so that we can allow full travel of the axle downward. We'll start out by removing the track bar. There's a bolt at each end, and the track bar will come out relatively easily. Also for this kit, we're going to be installing a track bar adapter plate, which will help to raise up the mounting location of one end of that track bar. Track bar. Loosen the control arm bolts. There are 8 bolts total on the rear to loosen up, but one of them actually you're going to remove, the driver's side lower. You'll be removing that to install the track bar adapter bracket later on. Remove the shocks. This one's pretty straightforward, except that I noticed you don't need to remove both bolts on the top bracket of the shock. Just loosen one and remove the other, and that'll really help you when you go to reassemble this. Remove the sway bar links. These you're going to want to remove and then save them to be used on the front axle. The bolt and the nuts will be reused here too. You'll likely need a backup wrench on the top link stud to hold it from spinning. Remove the brake line connector inside both rear wheel wells. You'll be using a drop-down bracket to lower this attachment point later on. Remove the plastic retainers that hold the ABS wiring in place so it has plenty of slack. Find the parking brake cable holder attached to the bottom of the floorboard and remove the two 10mm nuts in order to let those cables hang loose. Disconnect the axle vent tube on top of the axle. Lower the axle from the frame, watching for anything that could get tight or caught, and once the axles get low enough, those springs will practically fall out on their own. Make sure to save the rubber isolator pads from the top of each one to reuse on the new springs. Alright, we can begin reassembly of the new springs by placing the old isolator on top and then just simply setting the spring in place on the top of the axle. You're going to want to use the supplied bolt and retaining washer to keep the bottom of that spring in place. You have to use the supplied wrench to reach up from underneath on the back side of that spring mount, and you'll hold the nut with the special tool. Tighten the retaining washer in place, and that'll keep that spring from falling off when you try to lift the axle. Now you can install the track bar adapter bracket. This will utilize that bolt that we removed from the lower control arm on the driver's side, and it'll also attach to the factory track bar mounting location. You'll want to use the included spacer sleeve inside the mounting spot to prevent it from crushing the mount. And finally, you'll connect the bracket to the axle tube with the supplied U-bolt. You can snug this up, but you should wait to tighten it after the weight of the vehicle is completely down on the axle. Next, install the bump stop extenders by mounting them with the angled portion towards the front of the Jeep. Then just use the 2 supplied bolts and attach through the existing holes in the axle plate. This one's pretty easy actually. Install the new longer sway bar links, and when you put the bolts in, make sure that the nuts are towards the inside of the vehicle. Install the brake line drop extension bracket from the kit in the existing mounting hole. It will index nicely then with the factory bracket. Now you should be ready to begin lifting the axle back into place. Make sure the springs seat properly into position at the top, and then slowly put tension on the springs. Reconnect all the components that you removed to drop the axle. The new longer shocks can now be reinstalled, and that should complete the rear axle assembly. Alright, let's move to the front axle, which is nearly the same procedure as the rear other than the style of the bump stops. You'll want to remove anything that would limit the downward travel of the axle so that you can remove the front coil springs easily. Loosen the 4 control arm bolts. Remove 1 bolt from the passenger end of the track bar. Remove the sway bar links. We'll replace these with those rears that we removed earlier. Now you can remove the shocks. Sometimes it's very difficult to remove the top nut from the shock stud. If you have no reason to save the shocks, you may be able to bend them back and forth to break the studs off, if you're having trouble removing the nut on top. Loosen any brackets or hoses that will limit the travel of the axle downwards. I removed this brake line bracket from the frame and the axle. Now the axle can be lowered out as you carefully watch that nothing catches or gets tight. Some folks recommend that you disconnect the front drive shaft while others don't. I was able to complete the installation without removing the drive shaft, but it was tight. If I did another one of these, I would likely decide to remove the drive shaft and the differential. It would just make it a little bit easier and give me just a little bit more room, especially on the driver's side. To begin reassembly, you'll want to remove the factory bump stops and install the bump stop extensions that come in the TeraFlex kit. This is the portion of the install that gave me the most difficulty. I tried a few different ways to get that bump stop extender into the existing location. Yeah, the sledgehammer didn't work out. What I had to ultimately do was use a block of wood, and then I jacked up the axle against the bump stop extender to press them in. Once you get those in and they're secure, you can place your factory bump stops inside the extenders. Now you're ready to reinstall the springs. Make sure the bottom end of the spring indexes into the notch of the lower spring pocket. With the springs in and the bump stops secured, you can raise the axle back into place and begin reassembly. The sway bar can easily be moved into position with a little extra force. Put those rear sway bar links that you saved up front now. Be mindful of the orientation. It should look like this. The front track bar bolt may be easier to get in with the Jeep back on the ground. To help align the hole, you can have a helper push side to side on the body while the tires are on the ground, and that'll help to line it up. Mount up the shocks. They're pretty straightforward, but make sure you get the rubber bushings oriented correctly on top so that the large circular extrusion on the rubber goes into the shock tower mount hole. Okay, now you can replace any brackets, lines, or hoses that you had loosened up, and remember to tighten up those control arms. That should wrap up the installation. Now all that's left to do is let it down and see how it looks. I think it turned out great. Got nice clearance, it's got a nice look. It looks exactly like I want it to look. All right. To purchase a TeraFlex lift kit for your Jeep or to browse a huge selection of other aftermarket off-road accessories, including wheels and tires, be sure to visit offroad-source.com. Thanks so much for watching.